A Republican Party trying to navigate tax reform before year's end with Democrats united in opposition. We check in with Iowa's lone Democratic congressman in Washington, Dave Loebsack, on this edition of Iowa Press.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, the Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure.
I'm a dad.
I am a mom.
I'm a kid.
I'm a kid at heart. I'm a banker.
I'm an Iowa banker.
No matter who you are, there is an Iowa banker who is ready to help you get where you want to go. Iowa Bankers, allowing you to discover the genuine difference of Iowa banks.
For decades, Iowa Press has brought you politicians and newsmakers from across Iowa and beyond. Now celebrating more than 40 years of broadcast excellence on statewide Iowa Public Television. This is the Friday, November 17 edition of Iowa Press. Here is David Yepsen.
When examining Iowa's congressional representation in Washington, it brings to mind an old PBS kids show. One of these things is not like the other. In an era of nearly complete Republican control of Iowa's U.S. House and congressional delegations and Senate delegation, Dave Loebsack is our state's lone Democratic representative. And in a year of conservative health care votes and now tax reform legislation, the sixth-term congressman from Iowa City brings some unique perspective. Congressman, welcome back to Iowa Press.
Well, thank you very much. And David, it's always good to see you. Good to see you back in Iowa. I know it's been a while, but thank you for being here.
Well, it's good to be home.
Yeah.
Thanks. Across the table, James Lynch is political writer for the Gazette, and Kay Henderson is news director at Radio Iowa.
Congressman, you have a GOP tax plan that appears poised for action in the U.S. Senate. Several years ago, Democrats passed the Affordable Care Act. Shouldn't Americans come to expect these solely partisan packages advancing through Congress? Isn't bipartisanship dead?
Well, I don't think bipartisanship is dead. Certainly in this case, the Republicans decided in the House and in the Senate, and with the cooperation of President Trump, that they were going to go ahead and just come up with a tax bill that they were going to rush through, and that's what happened, of course, in the U.S. House. I did not vote for the tax bill, as you might imagine. 13 Republicans didn't vote for it either. The House version, it's hard to know what's going to happen in the Senate with the Senate version. I would not say that bipartisan's dead. I think it might be nearly dead. When it comes to these big pieces of legislation, those are pretty much partisan at this point, unfortunately. But you know that in Iowa that I actually work with the other side quite a bit, and on the Energy and Commerce Committee. So I actually work with the other side on all kinds of legislation related to my district.
So why criticize Republicans for doing what in their mind they were elected to do? They own all branches of the government for legislating. They own the executive and the legislative branch. Why criticize them for doing what they had told voters they would do?
Well, I'm not necessarily criticizing them, I'm just stating a fact. And also the fact of the matter is that the American people want us to work together. That's what I hear all the time when I'm in my district. When I did my 36 coffees with your congressman in my 24 counties, when I've done my 200 or so meetings with Iowans in the district this year, constantly I'm asked, why can't you folks work together? Why can't you get things done? The Iowa people, Iowans I talk to, they want us to work together. The American people want us to work together. I think that's the political reality, and I think that's the reality of representation in my district.
Well, you may have been focused on tax reform this week. A lot of Americans were following the latest accusations of sexual harassment by politicians. And one of the things we learned this week was a secret settlement fund the House has to handle claims like this. Right. Were you aware of that fund, and are you familiar with any of the settlements? And I guess, is that an appropriate use of taxpayer money?
I think you hit the nail right on the head. First of all, it is not an appropriate use of taxpayer money. In fact, I'm going to be doing what I can to make sure that we change the rules on that because taxpayers should not be on the hook for misdeeds that members of Congress or staff commit. In fact, yesterday morning I was talking to a Republican friend of mine in the U.S. House, and we were appalled by the fact, mutually appalled, both of us, by the fact that taxpayers are paying for these settlements. That shouldn't be the case as far as I'm concerned. Look, I think we also ought to make the person who commits some kind of an egregious act like this, we ought to make that person's I think we ought to make that person's name available to the public. I think we have to have some significant changes here, and we should make that person pay for whatever costs there may be associated with this particular action that gets taken by that individual.
How should Congress handle these accusations? I mean, is there a statute of limitations? Should Congress look at acts that happened before a person was elected to Congress? How far-reaching should Congress's, I guess, reaction to this go?
Right. Well, certainly in the case of Al Franken, my understanding is that, and he has admitted his wrongdoing, obviously, that happened before he was elected to the Congress. And I think it's perfectly within the bounds of reason to go ahead and have that ethics investigation of him, which Mitch McConnell's called for, which he has said he's more than happy to undergo as well. I don't know that we have a particular statute of limitations or a particular time frame, but clearly if somebody commits some kind of an egregious act like that, I think the American people need to know about it, and I think those people need to be held accountable. And I should say, obviously these kinds of acts of harassment or sexual aggression or whatever the case may be, these things know no political bounds, obviously, either. Both parties have members who are guilty of these kinds of offenses.
Some of your fellow Democrats, in moments of reflection, have suggested that Bill Clinton should have resigned the presidency. Are you among them?
Not at this point. I understand that Kirsten Gillibrand said that.
She's a senator from New York.
Yeah, apparently she said that. I haven't had enough time to think about, sort of all the ramifications.
It happened in the last century.
That's right.
And you haven't had enough time to think about it?
Well, not about those particular instances and what have you, but resignation is a big deal. And I haven't called for Donald Trump to resign because of the actions that he has committed and some of the things that he has said publicly. But I think they need to be held accountable. And I think we have to have a conversation, a very, very important national conversation about this issue. Because as I said, this is not a partisan issue. We have people on both sides of the aisle committing these egregious acts. And, I think we're at a point in our country's history where we really can think seriously about this and think back to what President Clinton did, think back to what President Trump did, think back to what others have done, and have a conversation about this and come to some kind of resolution.
Congressman, I want to switch gears. Do a little post-mortem with us on the 2016 election. You commissioned a study for the Iowa Democratic Party on the 2016 election.
Right.
What'd you find?
Well, look, I think basically what we're talking about here in Iowa, and a number of folks have alluded to the problems that the Democrats faced here in Iowa last time around. I think we've got a real problem, certainly in the rural areas. This is something that, that I've dealt with since I've been in Congress. I have a rural district. Every member of the U.S. House and both senators have rural areas. Here in Iowa, that's just the nature of the beast. That's what we have here demographically. And I've tried to deal with that as best I can, whether we're talking about strictly ag issues, a farm bill that we're going to have to pass this coming year, or any number of other issues, rural economic development. I think we don't speak to those rural areas. I don't think Democrats have spoken to those rural areas as a party as well as we could be. This is something that I've tried to do, as I said, when I have my 36 town hall meetings. I don't go just to the county seat. I go to smaller towns as well. I try to get out as much as I can. I visited numerous farms this year as well, especially in the southern part of my district where they were experiencing drought problems. This is the kind of thing that we have to go out there, and I borrow a phrase, if you will, I kind of paraphrase from some of the disabilities community. I think we have to go out where people live, work, and play, and we have to engage them. We have to listen to them more than anything else.
Is that what the autopsy told you? You weren't listening?
I think that's a part of it. That's right. We were not connecting with those folks. And that's self-evident, it seems to me. And it just confirmed a lot of what I was thinking. And there were a lot of Democrats who obviously didn't show up at the polls last time. And now we see a lot more engagement, a lot more excitement on the Democratic side of things, not just in Virginia, but around the country. But my own view is I've got to continue to do what I do, and that is get out and talk to as many folks as I can, do the visits that I do, and listen as best I can.
Is what happened in Virginia instructive for anything that could happen in Iowa?
I think in the sense, Iowa's not Virginia demographically, and I think folks here in Iowa know that. But clearly the enthusiasm and the energy on the part of the Democratic side of the aisle is very high at this point. And the real test is going to be to keep that going and keep that motivated. And again, you know, in my district, I just get around as much as I can. I talk to folks on both sides of the aisle. I talk to those who are not of either party and do what I can to engage them.
I mean, one of the reasons I ask that question is in Virginia, as you noted, there was a big surge in Democratic turnout.
Right.
Republican turnout stayed
About
pretty
the
good.
same.
Now in Iowa, the election of 2016 was much more Republican than
That's
it
right.
was.
It was just the reverse of Virginia
Reverse.
right now. That's
Are there enough Democrats in Iowa who didn't go to the polls in 2016 that will show up in 2018 to make a big difference in the outcome?
I have no doubt about that. And there were a number of folks on the Democratic side of the aisle as well who voted for Donald Trump. And I was fortunate in my district, a number of them voted for me. And that's why I'm still in Congress. But we have to find out, you know, sort of what makes those folks tick. What are the issues that are of concern to them? You know, why are they so angry, and do our best to make sure that we listen to them and do what we can to make sure that we answer their questions.
You're an old political science professor before you got elected to Congress.
I try not to do that at this point if I can help it.
Is Iowa becoming a more Republican state? You look at the demographics, it's a rural state, it's white, there are a lot of non-college voters here, older. That's the profile of a Trump voter.
Yeah, that's right. But I think that folks on both sides of the aisle, if they're completely honest with you, would say that it's far too early to know that. We have one data point, you know, the last election, maybe 14 as well. I'm not willing to cede that kind of ground as the only Democrat left in Iowa in the U.S. congressional delegation. I'd like to see more of me here in the U.S. Congress, as you might imagine.
Congressman, in spite of that enthusiasm that you talk about among Democrats, there's still also some divisions. The Bernie versus Hillary split. Donna Brazile is alleging that the nomination process was rigged. When and can Democrats put 2016 behind them and start looking ahead to 2018?
I think they did that in Virginia to a very great extent because there were those kinds of divisions within Virginia as well. There were concerns about the gubernatorial candidate and some of the issues.
Have Iowa Democrats put it behind them?
I think that we're getting very far down that road. I really do believe that. We've got great candidates running for governor. We've got a number of people running for Congress in a number of districts, and I think that that's happening as we speak here in Iowa. We've got a little distance to go yet, but I wouldn't underestimate Democrats in Iowa to get motivated and come out next time.
Do Democrats have a realistic shot of taking control of the U.S. House in 2018? How do they do that?
Well, there's no question. Again, I think a lot of it is doing what I try to do in my own district, you know. And when I talk to folks who want to run for Congress, I say, look, you know, sure, you got to go out and do all the things you have to do to build a campaign and raise the money and all that, but you also have to get out there and talk to people, and that's what I did the first time I ran. I went all around the then 15 counties and tried to talk to as many people as I could. Some people didn't want to talk to me, and I understand that, you know, when you're a challenger. But that's really what we have to do more than anything, and listen to people. That's really the key, I think, in many ways.
How important is getting control of the House in 2018? I mean, is this sort of a do-or-die election for Democrats?
I think it's important to lay the groundwork for 2020, but I think it's important, you know, because the American people, if you look at where they stand now on the issues, almost in every instance, they have a lot of concerns about President Trump. And we'll see how 18 turns out, but I think 18 could very well be, in no small measure, a referendum on President Trump and on his policies, but that remains to be seen.
Some of your colleagues in the U.S. House of Representatives have introduced impeachment against the president. Why didn't you join them?
Well, we've got a process right now that we see ongoing. We've got committees that are looking into the Russia situation in both the House and the Senate. We've got the special counsel Robert Mueller looking into all this, and my own view is that, you know, we should wait and see what comes of those particular investigations, and then we'll go from there.
So is it helpful for your Democratic colleagues to be talking about impeachment?
Well, it's something that I don't talk about, you know, in my district. You know, I'll hear what people have to say about that, but we've got the investigation ongoing, and I'll leave it at that.
Can your party win in 2018 if you're the anti-Trump party?
No, definitely not, and that's why I talk all the time about a good infrastructure package, about education, about rural education, rural health care. rural broadband, all kinds of issues that are really important for my district, for my state, and for the country. This is something that I do what I can to talk about and to advocate for. No, I don't think it's ever a good idea just to be against something. You know, clearly the American people differ with Donald Trump.
Didn't you win by being against George Bush?
That was part of it, but I also offered alternatives too in terms of what the direction that we ought to be taking the country. And I think that's something that we've got to do moving forward. I think it's incumbent upon me to do that, to offer that alternative.
Real quickly before we move on, if Democrats don't take control of the House, is it time for Nancy Pelosi to go?
Oh, we'll face that problem or that bridge when we get to that point. We'll see who's running, who isn't, that sort of thing. And you know, I couldn't possibly answer that question at this point.
Congressman, I want to switch gears again, and I want to talk about some of the specific issues that you're dealing with in Congress. You're on the Energy Committee. Wind energy and renewable fuels, biofuels, big issue in our state and particularly in your district. Is all this tax legislation that's flying through going to be harmful or helpful?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I voted against this tax bill, because especially on wind energy, there's a real attack in this bill on the production tax credit. For example, under this bill, projects that are going to be constructed beginning next year are going to receive half the credit of the previous projects. And we've seen, for example, Mid-American has come out and they said this is going to put in jeopardy lots of projects here in Iowa. You know, I have Siemens in my district and they build blades, and I have TPI Composites in Newton and they build blades, and I've got Trinity Structural Towers in Newton and they build the towers themselves. And we have over 7,000 jobs in Iowa because of the production tax credit. Chuck Grassley is the father of the production tax credit. We know about wind in Iowa. We've got to continue to make sure that we have those jobs and that we go forward. That's one of the big reasons why I voted against that legislation. And so we've got to go forward. You mentioned biofuels. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Biofuels Caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives, and that's a bipartisan caucus. We have to make sure that the renewable fuel standard is protected. Now, Secretary Pruitt, Administrator Pruitt from the EPA has given assurances, you know, and we're trying to hold the president's feet to the fire on this, that the volumes, which haven't been announced yet, for biodiesel, for ethanol, for advanced ethanol, that they're going to be where they're supposed to be according to the renewable fuel standard. That remains to be seen. But I'm going to continue to hold this administration's feet to the fire because those have created thousands of jobs here in Iowa, tens of thousands of jobs. And they're good for farmers, and it's good to get us off foreign oil, that dependence on foreign oil, and it's good for the environment. But I might also say, during the last administration, one evening I had two things I had to go to. One function was at the White House, and the other I'll tell you in a minute. But I went to the White House, and I proudly wore my very, very big button that said, "Don't mess with the RFS." And a White House advisor asked me where I was going next, and I said, "I'm going to the corn growers meeting, so don't mess with the RFS." So I'm bipartisan, and my holding administration's accountable for this.
Congressman, the House recently approved some changes in National Flood Insurance Program.
Right.
I think you voted against that.
I did.
What's the problem with those changes? How is that going to affect Iowans, and especially Eastern Iowans?
Yeah, look, I mean, the main problem with that bill is that I don't think it struck an appropriate balance in terms of making sure that people do what's responsible and not necessarily building in floodplains. That balance, making sure, and then penalizing those folks who happen to live in a floodplain and have lived there for quite some time, because it really does increase their premiums pretty dramatically over time. I think we can find a better balance. I don't want to punish those who've necessarily been there for quite some time in a floodplain and they can't move for whatever reason. And look, we also have to make sure that we have flood maps that are accurate. Since the Great Flood here in Iowa in 2008, I've had to fight battles with FEMA on behalf of communities to make sure that those flood maps are accurate and that people are not, unfortunately, or really not appropriately put into a floodplain so that they have to go out and get the flood insurance when they have. So we've got to have a better balance than what was in this bill.
Although you no longer represent Cedar Rapids, you've been working on trying to help Cedar Rapids get flood mitigation money. Realistically, is the city ever going to see that flood mitigation money?
I think there's a chance, and I'm working with Rod Blum on that, and the senators as well. We're doing what we can. We have to make sure that the money does come. We have to make sure that and I asked a core person at one of our meetings recently about that, making sure that when we talk about the benefit to cost ratio, that it reflects the different parts of the country, that we don't use the same formula for the entire country, because obviously in Iowa it's not the same as it is in New York City or whatever the case may be. So I think we're working on that. I think we can make some progress on that. It remains to be seen whether we can get all the funding that we need. But just because I don't represent Cedar Rapids any longer doesn't mean I'm not going to fight for those folks.
Should Cedar Rapids count on that money, or should they wait until they see it before they start taking action?
Well, I think it's fair to say, given the problems that the federal government has had with the budget and all the rest, it's hard to count on anything like that. But I can tell you that I'll continue to work as hard as I can to make sure that funding does come.
In your district, union folks are cheering the potential end of the North American Free Trade Agreement, while farmers are saying, hey, wait a minute, please renegotiate it. The U.S. Secretary of Commerce said the tales of woe from farmers are exaggerated. It's not as if, in his opinion, people around the globe are going to stop eating.
Right.
How do you come down on NAFTA? Should it end?
Well, I think that Commerce Secretary Ross was inaccurate in his assessment. I thought it was really quite unfeeling of him to say those words, to be totally blunt about it. Although I've chatted with him about other issues where he's actually done some good things. The sugar problem that we had between Mexico and the United States, that got resolved. I think that was the wrong interpretation of how we should look at this. I signed on to a bipartisan bill with a lot of other folks to the president that said, look, if you renegotiate NAFTA, and I think some parts of it should be renegotiated, especially when it comes to labor and environmental regulations, but if you do that, do no harm to agriculture, because Iowa, as you all know, depends heavily on those exports to Mexico and to Canada, Mexico in particular. And it's not just agricultural exports either. We have a plant over in Burlington that makes the satellite dishes, and the market here in Iowa or in America is largely saturated, and they depend upon Mexico as a market too. So when the president goes out and attempts to renegotiate, I think that he has to be very, very careful. The other thing is the Mexicans and the Canadians, they're a lot stronger than they were as countries back in 1993 and 1994. So I would just caution the president and his folks in the administration to be very, very careful about how they approach these negotiations and don't harm agriculture in Iowa.
James?
Iowa and other states are individually taking a variety of actions to combat the opioid crisis, which claimed about 180 lives here in Iowa last year. What can or what should Congress be doing to address this problem that's claiming so many lives?
Right. Well, unfortunately, it's going to take a fair amount of resources to deal with, and that's been agreed to on a bipartisan basis. We had money in the Cures bill that passed, and that was passed on a bipartisan basis. We have to, first of all, I think we have to assess the problem, which we haven't been able to do. It is pretty extensive. It's not as extensive in Iowa as it is in some other places. But what I like to do is go out with law enforcement on a regular basis, whether it's a county sheriff or a county sheriff's deputy or police chief or one of the police chief's assistants. And that's one of the questions that I ask them in every instance, that mental health, a number of other issues that they face. And the opioid crisis is beginning to have real effects here in the state of Iowa. So I think we, first of all, have to understand what it is, and that it is something that's society-wide. It's painkillers, but it's heroin, it's a lot of different things.
Well, should the federal government limit the number of pills that can be issued in a prescription?
I don't know that I'd go that far. I think we have to make sure that we understand the problem before something like that is even offered.
There are 20,000 Iowans who are pulling their hair out because they're buying health care insurance for 2018
Right.
on the individual market.
That's right.
As someone who voted for the Affordable Care Act, What do you say to them? They're not happy.
I say that the Affordable Care Act was not perfect by any means, and I think in Iowa we've seen an extreme case of that in some ways. You know, a lot of different factors played into what happened here in Iowa. I met with the insurance commissioner right before he made his attempt to have a particular solution to it here in Iowa. And clearly what we need is not an attempt to repeal and replace and get rid of it entirely, which is what I think repealing the mandate in the Senate tax bill probably would lead to eventually. That's not being said, but I think that would be the effect. We got to have a bipartisan approach to this, and first we have to stabilize the insurance markets, and that's where the bipartisan bill in the U.S. Senate, I think there's real hope there, and I think that can provide hope to folks in Iowa as well. We do have only that one plan, that one insurance company, Medica, which covers almost all the counties now, but we're seeing very large increases, obviously, in the premiums. But clearly we've got to have more choices in these markets, but we've got to have a bipartisan approach, and we have to make sure that the payments that the administration is obligated to make continue to come to Iowa as well.
Congressman, we have about a half a minute left. You've talked several times about bipartisanship, but is there a center in Congress? Or is it just fractured ideologically and nobody is willing to compromise and nothing is getting done?
I think the main problem is at the leadership level, and I've said this over and over again in both parties, because they're always out to sort of who's going to maintain the majority, who's going to get the majority. And then unfortunately, many of us who want to cooperate and try to get things done on a bipartisan basis, the perversity of this is that we end up getting targeted in the elections as well by the other side. But there are a lot of us who are going to continue to work together on this, I can guarantee you.
Congressman, thank you for being with us. We're out of time.
No, thank you so much.
Appreciate you being with us again.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining our latest edition of Iowa Press. We'll be back next week with Iowa Senate Minority Leader Janet Peterson as the state's legislative session looms on the horizon. Next week is our Fall Festival Pledge Drive, so catch Iowa Press just on Friday night at 7:30 on our main IPTV channel, with a rebroadcast on our .3 World channel Saturday morning at 8:30. For all of us here at Iowa Public Television, I'm David Yepsen, and thanks for joining us today.
Funding for Iowa Press was provided by Friends, the Iowa Public Television Foundation, the Associated General Contractors of Iowa, the public's partner in building Iowa's highway, bridge, and municipal utility infrastructure.
I'm a dad.
I am a mom.
I'm a kid.
I'm a kid at heart. I'm a banker.
I'm an Iowa banker.
No matter who you are, there is an Iowa banker who is ready to help you get where you want to go. Iowa Bankers, allowing you to discover the genuine difference of Iowa banks.